Say this is your nose. Anterior, middle, and posterior cranial fossa, the foramen magnum, and this is your bony orbit. And here will be your foramen ovale, and right beneath the foramen ovale is the otic ganglia. Just above the foramen ovale will be the trigeminal ganglia. Of course, it's a sensory ganglia, and it has three divisions: the ophthalmic division, the maxillary division, and the mandibular division. The mandibular division comes out through the middle cranial fossa, through the foramen ovale. Now let's look at the otic ganglia from a frontal view. Say this is your head, and these are your ears, and this is the nose, and this is the foramen ovale. The otic ganglion is right beneath it. The mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve passes through the foramen ovale like this on both the sides. And here is an important muscle that inserts onto the soft palate. This is the soft palate. It inserts onto the soft palate like this from both the sides. So when this muscle contracts, it pulls the soft palate to both the sides like this, and that's why the soft palate gets tensed. So this muscle is called tensor veli palatini. Artery coming from beneath, called the middle meningeal artery. When it reaches the otic ganglion, it passes behind it. Variations of the otic ganglia. Laterally, it's bounded by the mandibular nerve. Medially, by the tensor veli palatini. Posteriorly, it has the middle meningeal artery. And superiorly, it has the foramen ovale. The otic ganglia receives parasympathetic nerves, sympathetic nerves, motor nerves, and sensory nerves. As you know, there are four main parasympathetic ganglia in our body. They are the ciliary ganglia, the pterygopalatine ganglia, the otic ganglia, and the submandibular ganglia. The ciliary ganglia receives the parasympathetic inflow from the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. The pterygopalatine as well as the submandibular ganglia receive parasympathetic neurons from the superior salivary nucleus, whereas the otic ganglia receives parasympathetic inflow from the inferior salivary nucleus. So here is your brainstem. Here lies, this is your pons and this is your medulla, and here lies the superior salivary nucleus, and here lies the inferior salivary nucleus. Remember I told you parasympathetic neurons, which have to reach the otic ganglia, arise from the inferior salivary nucleus. So this is that neuron. This is the nucleus tractus solitarius, and this is the spinal nucleus. Fibers from these two nuclei also come out, and all these neurons travel together inside the ninth cranial nerve. That's the glossopharyngeal nerve. So this is the ninth cranial nerve. The ninth cranial nerve has a superior ganglia and then an inferior ganglia. And that is where the parasympathetic neurons come to. From here they leave the ninth nerve and they become the tympanic branch of the ninth cranial nerve, whereas the rest of the sensory neurons just pass through the ninth cranial nerve just as it is. This is the ninth cranial nerve. And now let's see where the tympanic branch of the ninth cranial nerve carrying the parasympathetic neurons go to. This is your middle cranial fossa, and this is the anterior cranial fossa. here lies your foramen ovale, and as you know, just beneath it lies the otic ganglia, and here lies your middle ear, right beneath the middle cranial fossa. Okay, this is the medial wall of the middle ear, and this is the posterior wall of the middle ear, and this is the anterior wall of the middle ear, which is cut, and this is the floor of the middle ear, and in the lateral wall I'm not showing it. And so this is the promontory, which is on the middle wall of the middle ear. This is the promontory, right? And now our tympanic branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve goes like this, pierces the floor, right? It pierces the floor and makes a plexus around the promontory. After the plexus, the nerve comes out, goes upwards and goes downwards through the foramen ovale, and then relays in the otic ganglia. So the branch which is coming out through the inferior ganglion of the ninth cranial nerve, the inferior ganglion, also known as the petrosal ganglia. However, from here onwards, it's called the tympanic branch of glossopharyngeal nerve. After it comes out through the parasympathetic plexus of tympanic plexus around the promontory, it's called the lesser petrosal nerve. Comes out through the foramen ovale and relays in the otic ganglia. Now let's look at where the sympathetic neurons come from. So this is your spinal cord, and this is your T1 spinal segment. These are your cervical segments, spinal segments, and this is your T1 segment. From here comes your sympathetic neuron. It goes like this and passes through the inferior cervical ganglia, middle cervical ganglia, and superior cervical ganglia. By the way, what are these ganglia? These three ganglia, the inferior, middle, and superior cervical ganglia, constitute the sympathetic cervical chain. Right? So this sympathetic nerve arising from the T1 passes through the inferior ganglia, the middle ganglia, and the superior cervical sympathetic ganglia, and finally relays over here. Then it passes upward and finds the middle meningeal artery and forms a plexus around it and reaches the otic ganglia and finally reaches the otic ganglia. So from here, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic neurons have to reach the parotid gland, because that gland is what our nerves are supplying. How do they reach the parotid gland? Remember, this is your mandibular nerve coming from your trigeminal ganglia, right? The mandibular nerve gives out a branch called the auriculotemporal nerve. It's like this. It's like a hook around the originating from the mandibular nerve. These parasympathetic neurons, which relay here, catch the auriculotemporal nerve, which is reaching the parotid gland. It catches it and relays it supplies the parotid gland. Same way, the sympathetic nerves also catch the auriculotemporal nerve and supply the parotid gland. End of story. A brief summary of the otic ganglia. So it's one of the parasympathetic ganglia, receives sympathetic, parasympathetic, sensory, and motor neurons, whereas only parasympathetic neurons relay in the otic ganglia. The other types of neurons only pass through the ganglia. The parasympathetic neurons originate from the inferior salivary nucleus, traverse inside the glossopharyngeal nerve, and from the inferior ganglion of the ninth nerve, they separate, means they branch out, and that's called the tympanic branch of the ninth cranial nerve. Then it goes all the way to the middle ear and reaches the promontory and makes a parasympathetic tympanic plexus around the promontory. From there, it arises as the lesser petrosal nerve, passes downward through the foramen ovale, and relays in the otic ganglia. From there, it catches the auriculotemporal branch of the mandibular nerve and reach the parotid gland. Same way, the sympathetic neurons arise from the T1 spinal segment of the spinal cord and reach the inferior sympathetic cervical ganglia, the middle cervical ganglia, and the superior sympathetic cervical ganglia, and finally relay there. And then the postganglionic fibers reach the middle meningeal artery, they coil around it, make a plexus, and then reach the otic ganglia. They do not relay over there, they just pass through the otic ganglia and catch the auriculotemporal nerve and reach the parotid gland. The motor neurons which pass through the otic ganglion come from the mandibular nerve. That is the nerve to the medial pterygoid. It's said that this motor neuron is just passing through the otic ganglion to basically give it a physical support to the ganglion for it to stay in its place.